The kitchen smelled faintly of espresso and something expensive, like polished stone and distant rain. James Crawford stood at the marble counter, staring at the slim white stick lying there as if it were something radioactive. Two pink lines. Positive. He loosened his tie, his fingers suddenly clumsy, and tried to speak. The words felt heavy, alien. Across from him, Emma Thompson stood still in her scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, her face flushed with the kind of hope that only comes after years of waiting for good news. And this should have been good news. "We'll move together," she said quietly, as if stating a fact no one could argue. "James, this is our baby." But James didn't look at her. His jaw tightened. His hand smoothed the front of his suit jacket in a gesture that told her everything she needed to know. "There is no we in this decision," he said. His voice was flat, cold, like he was reading a line from some tired script. "The board has already approved the merger. I'm marrying Helen Chen next month." Her breath left her in a slow, stunned exhale. For a moment there was only silence. Emma's hands curled tightly around the edge of the counter, steadying herself against the blow. "Helen Chen," she repeated, tasting the name like acid. "Your investor's daughter. How long has this been going on?" James still wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's not what you think," he said too smoothly. "It's business." She almost laughed. Almost. But it caught in her throat, tight and bitter. "I'm carrying your child," Emma said. "And you're standing there telling me about business." He picked up his briefcase as if they were in a conference room, ending a meeting. "You'll be taken care of," he said. "The penthouse is yours. The accounts will be transferred by morning." "You mean your lawyers will handle it?" she said, her voice cracking. He turned to leave. His hand paused on the doorknob, but he didn't look back. "Don't try to contact me." And then he was gone. Just like that. Emma stood in the echoing silence of the apartment, the soft digital beep of the pregnancy test punctuating the stillness. Positive. She hadn't imagined it. Her hand rested instinctively on her stomach, as if she could shield the life growing inside her from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Sarah. How did he take the news? Another buzz. A news alert. Cord Technologies announces merger with Chen Global. CEO James Crawford to wed Helen Chen in private Singapore ceremony. The room tilted. Emma stumbled toward the bathroom, barely making it before she was sick. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the cold tile, her hands braced against the porcelain. Her pager shrieked, "Trauma call. Emergency surgery." No time for breakdowns. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at the reflection glaring back at her from the mirror. She was Dr. Emma Thompson, a surgeon, a professional, a woman who had worked too hard to lose everything now. She grabbed her keys on her way out, slipping the pregnancy test into her pocket. It wasn't sentimentality. It was evidence. Proof that her life had changed. Twice. By the time she reached her car, her phone was buzzing again. Another system notification. Your access to the following accounts has been terminated. She swiped it away without reading. There were lives to save. Hers could wait. The morning after her shift, Emma stood at an ATM. The screen flashed the same message over and over. Account access denied. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the machine, exhaustion and panic blending into something sharp in her chest. "Dark. Thompson." Sarah's voice cut through the fog. She appeared with 2 coffee cups, her scrubs pristine. "You look like hell." Emma took the cup without thinking. "He cleaned out everything," she said. "Even my personal account." "That's illegal," Sarah snapped. "He can't." "He did." Emma scrolled through her notifications showing Sarah the evidence. The penthouse locks had already been changed. "I tried going home after my shift." Sarah stared at her. "You slept in the on-call room. It's fine." Emma took a sip of coffee and grimaced. "Morning sickness makes this taste like battery acid." "You're moving in with me." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "I've already got the spare room ready." Sarah. "I've mapped out 3 banks within walking distance of the hospital." Sarah continued. "We'll open a new account at lunch. My cousin's a lawyer. He's already drawing up paperwork." Emma's throat tightened, the tears coming fast and hot. Don't thank me," Sarah warned, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything." Emma whispered. "When you're back on your feet." and you will be. We make him regret ever hearing the name Emma Thompson. Emma's pager beeped again. Another emergency. She wiped her face, straightened her coat, and managed a weak smile. Deal. 3 months later, Emma sat in Sarah's living room. The glossy cover of a business magazine stared back at her. James and Helen, the picture perfect couple. Singapore glittered in the background of their wedding photos. Stop torturing yourself, Sarah muttered, taking the magazine away. Look at this instead. A hospital letter. Emma read the words twice. They approved it. Full funding, Sarah confirmed. You're leading your own research team. While James had been marrying for mergers, Emma had been revolutionizing pediatric surgery. Her hand settled on her belly as the baby kicked. Not long now. Her phone buzzed. Another missed call from Margaret Crawford. She blocked the number. She keeps calling the hospital. She's your baby's grandmother, Sarah said carefully. She's his grandmother, Emma corrected. I'm not going back to Boston. You're building something here, Sarah said. And you're not alone. Emma reached for her laptop, opening the investment tracker Michael had set up. Small, cautious steps. Buying stock, gaining leverage. 3 years from now, she'd be ready. She'd never see it coming. As she headed out for another emergency consult, Emma smiled quietly to herself. Let James build his empire in Singapore. She was building something stronger. A legacy. And this time, no one would take it away. Emma's hands were steady, despite the pain lancing through her back. The pressure was sharp, insistent, but she ignored it. She'd gotten used to ignoring pain. On the surgical table, a tiny heart stilled under the glare of cold operating lights. Her focus was absolute. BP's Clemming. Dura. Martinez warned from across the table. I'm aware, Emma said, her voice crisp. She adjusted her grip on the surgical tools, barely feeling the contraction that seized her. We're not closing until this heart beats on its own. Sarah stood nearby, watching her closely, concern dark in her eyes. Emma, she said quietly, let me finish. Almost done, Emma said, already closing the final suture. And then, there it was, the beep of a steady rhythm. The child's heart found its pace. Dear, close for me, Emma murmured, stepping back. And then her knees buckled. Strong hands caught her before she hit the floor. She's in labor, Sarah barked, snapping orders. Someone was shoving an IV into her arm. Emma winced but didn't fight it. She was too busy counting heartbeats in her head. Hers the baby's. The child she'd just saved. They wheeled her through the corridors she knew better than her own home, her surgical gown swapped for a hospital one. It was surreal, lying in a bed when for years she'd been the one giving orders. Not this time. 14 hours. Sarah muttered, wiping sweat from Emma's brow hours later. You really know how to make an entrance. And then Lucas arrived, his lungs full of fight and fury, his cry echoing off the sterile white walls. Emma stared at him, stunned by how small and perfect he was. Black hair, dark eyes that squinted open just long enough to look directly at her. He had James's chin, her eyes. He looks like him, Emma whispered. Sarah leaned close, her voice firm. No, he looks like you strong. Stubborn. A miracle. A nurse entered carrying a massive bouquet of flowers. From Margaret Crawford, she explained, placing them by the window. The card was simple. Congratulations. Emma didn't ask how she knew. It was Margaret. She always knew. Later, after the stitches and the paperwork and the constant parade of well-meaning nurses, Emma sat alone with Lucas. He was swaddled tight, his tiny fist gripping her finger as if he'd never let go. We're going to be okay, she promised him softly, you and me. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Breaking news. Crawford Technologies opened its Singapore headquarters, James smiling for the cameras, hand in hand with Helen Chen. Building the future, the caption read. Emma smiled faintly and glanced at Lucas. Let him build whatever he wants, she whispered. We're building something better. 3 years passed like a storm. Quiet at times, violent at others. Emma's life was a carefully balanced act of surgery schedules and single motherhood. Lucas was precocious from the start, walking early, talking in full sentences by 18 months. By 2, he was assembling puzzles designed for children twice his age. Sarah watched him with equal parts pride and exasperation. He's a genius, she said one afternoon, watching Lucas demolish a 100-piece dinosaur puzzle in 10 minutes flat. You realize that, right? Emma smiled without looking up from her research notes. Most kids are special, Sarah snorted. Yours is terrifying. On the muted television, a headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Crawford Technologies stock plummets amid divorce rumors. CEO James Crawford and Helen Chen expected to separate. Sarah muted it before Emma could glance up. It's not worth your time. I'm not worried about James, Emma said, though she had seen the news weeks ago. Margaret had called her from Boston, still trying to reach out, still trying to mend something Emma wasn't sure could ever be whole. Lucas appeared in the doorway, holding up a piece of his puzzle. Mommy, can you help? Emma stood, stretching tired muscles. Always. As they worked together on the puzzle, her phone buzzed again. Johns Hopkins. An invitation to present her latest pediatric heart procedure at the international conference. She smiled. Baltimore next month. Convenient timing. That was when James was set to receive his innovation award. He's not your problem anymore, Sarah said quietly later that night, watching Emma pack for the trip. No, Emma agreed. But his company is. The hospital gala was dazzling. Emma walked the red carpet in emerald silk, Lucas holding her hand. At 3, he looked heartbreakingly handsome in his little tuxedo. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. Sarah appeared at her side, her voice low. He's here. Emma didn't flinch. Of course James was there. Crawford Technologies had donated a wing to the hospital. She spotted him across the room. He hadn't changed much. Older. Tired around the eyes, but still polished. He stared at them. Emma, Lucas, Sarah, as if he were looking at strangers. Emma held her head high and moved toward the stage. She spoke of tiny hearts, the ones she'd fixed and the ones still waiting, of resilience and hope. Lucas stood proudly beside her as she accepted the award, placing it in her hands as he said clearly into the microphone, "Congratulations, Dr. Mommy." Applause thundered. James was still watching from the bar. He didn't move. He didn't speak later. As Lucas charmed the hospital board, Sarah nudged Emma. He left. Emma nodded. Good. The next morning brought chaos. Margaret's health was failing, the cancer stealing what strength she had left. Emma rushed to her side, Lucas in tow. Singapore. Margaret whispered, Helen wants you there. You should go. Emma stayed silent. The offer was dangerous. Helen was offering leverage. An alliance. Margaret squeezed her hand. Lucas will want to see me while he can. Emma nodded. I'll bring him after surgery. She flew to Singapore 2 days later. The boardroom was sterile and cold. James's face was white when she walked in. Helen's smile was tight and sharp. Emma connected her laptop to the screen. Footage of Lucas solving complex problems played for the entire board. This is Lucas Thompson, she said. My son. And James, Chaos erupted. I'm voting my shares and my son's shares in favor of Helen Chen, Emma said. James Crawford is hereby removed as CEO. Her phone buzzed as she left. Margaret was crashing. Emma ran for the airport. Margaret passed before she landed. At the hospital, Lucas held his grandmother's hand. Emma joined them, tears blurring her vision. She left something for you, Sarah said, handing Emma an envelope and a USB drive. Inside was everything. The merger papers, backdated stock transfers, evidence of fraud. James had orchestrated everything before he knew about the baby. Emma, read the letter last. Use this wisely. Not for revenge. For losing she would. Margaret had trusted her with the future. Her phone buzzed again. She answered. You won, he said quietly. No, Emma said. I just stopped losing. She hung up. At home, Lucas slept peacefully. She sealed Margaret's and James's letters in an envelope for him to read when he was 18. And then she wrote her own. You were always my choice. She closed it and tucked it away. Her pager buzzed. Emergency surgery. She slipped on her coat. Some choices echo forever, but sometimes they become something else entirely. The conference hall was quiet, the lights dimmed, except for the stage where Emma stood behind the podium. Her hand rested lightly on the glass award she had just received, but her gaze was fixed on the front row. Lucas, now 6, sat straight back between Sarah and one of his favorite nurses, his tiny hands folded neatly on his lap. He gave her a thumbs up, grinning wide enough to make his dimples appear. The same dimples his father had, but deeper somehow, more sure of themselves. This work began. Emma started, her voice steady but warm, with a question. How can we make tiny hearts stronger, safer, and give children the futures they deserve? She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. Some were peers, some competitors, and many had dismissed her early work as impossible. They were listening now. What I've found over these years is that innovation doesn't come from certainty. It comes from necessity. And no one teaches you about necessity more than a child who needs a chance to live. She caught sight of movement near the back of the auditorium. A figure, lingering just beyond the glow of the lights. James. He stood quietly, not drawing attention, not stepping closer. But he was there, watching. Emma turned back to the microphone, ignoring the way her pulse jumped. And no one teaches you about hope more than a child who refuses to give up. She smiled toward Lucas. Or a child who believes he can help fix the world. The crowd erupted into applause. Lucas clapped too, though his attention was already shifting to the small model heart on the table nearby. Emma stepped down from the stage and let the organizer hand her a second certificate. Another recognition. Another reminder that all her late nights and early mornings mattered. Sarah met her at the bottom of the stairs. He left, she said quietly, without looking at Emma. Emma nodded. Good. Later, as they walked back to their hotel suite, Lucas skipping ahead between them, Sarah broke the silence again. You know, you're going to have to talk to him sometime. Emma shook her head. No, I don't. He's his father. No, Emma corrected. James was a decision. Lucas is the consequence, and I don't owe James anything. Sarah sighed but didn't argue. At breakfast the next morning, Lucas studied the menu with all the seriousness of a surgeon planning an operation. Mommy, can I have pancakes shaped like hearts? Emma smiled as she flagged down the server. We can do that. They were halfway through their meal when Lucas spoke again, his voice quiet. Grandma Margaret would have liked these. Emma's chest tightened. She would have loved them, she agreed. Do you think Daddy liked pancakes when he was a little boy? Lucas asked without looking up. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Emma took a breath. Maybe, she said carefully. But I don't know. Lucas nodded, as if filing the information away for later. He was like that. Always listening, always watching. James's mind, Margaret had said once. Emma believed it. But Lucas's heart, well, that was all his own. 2 months later, Emma stood in the Margaret Crawford pediatric wing, watching Lucas read aloud to a group of younger patients. He read with exaggerated voices, pausing to explain words they didn't understand. He was patient, kind, and when he finished, he let them pass his tablet around so they could see the virtual heart models he'd designed. Sarah appeared at her side. We have a problem. Emma tore her gaze from Lucas reluctantly. What now? James, Sarah said quietly. He's here. Emma's stomach tightened. Here, in the lobby. Emma exhaled slowly. Does Lucas know? Sarah shook her head. He's busy being amazing. Emma squared her shoulders and walked down to the lobby. James was standing near the reception desk, holding a thick file. He looked tired, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp. I'm not here to make trouble, he said before she could speak. I wanted to give you this. He held out the folder. What is it? Emma asked without reaching for it. Proof, James said quietly. Proof that I'm trying to do something right. She stared at him for a long moment before taking it. Inside were documents, plans for a charity, funding for pediatric cardiac research, donations to children's hospitals, including hers. Why? Emma asked, flipping through the pages. Because Lucas deserves better, James said. And I can't undo what I did. But I can do this. Emma nodded slowly. You're not meeting him. James's jaw tightened. Wasn't going to ask. But they both knew he was lying. Emma closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. This doesn't change anything. I know. As she turned to walk away, he said softly, He's brilliant, isn't he? Emma stopped but didn't turn around. He's mine. Lucas came home that night with a new drawing for his wall. It was a heart. Not the cartoon kind with scalloped edges, but a perfect anatomical model in red and blue, arteries, veins, valves. And inside it, he had written, Mommy Lucas Pastrong. Emma hung it above his bed after he fell asleep. By the time Lucas was 7, his name was known in pediatric research circles. He'd co-authored a paper with Emma. Well, he dictated it while she typed, and was already designing models for surgical tools. Margaret had left him a legacy. Emma had given him a future, and he was building both, piece by careful piece. One evening, after a long day in surgery, Emma came home to find Lucas sitting at the kitchen table, his brows furrowed. "Problem?" she asked. "I'm thinking about asking Daddy to come to my science fair." But Emma felt the floor till under her feet. "Why?" Lucas shrugged. "He made mistakes. But Grandma said everyone deserves a chance to fix them." Emma sat down slowly. "Do you want to see him?" "I want to see if he wants to see me," Lucas said simply. Emma reached across the table and took his hand. "Okay." That night, she wrote a letter, short, direct. "Lucas wants to see you. One meeting, one chance, no more." She sent it and waited. The science fair was crowded, filled with bright colors, handmade posters, and the excited chatter of children explaining projects that ranged from baking soda volcanoes to solar-powered robots. Lucas stood beside his exhibit, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unusually serious for a 7-year-old. His project was no ordinary display. On the table sat a working 3D printed model of a human heart, programmed to show blood flow through valves and arteries. He'd named it Harmony. Emma watched him from a distance, her heart pounding in ways that had nothing to do with pride. Sarah nudged her gently. "You don't have to look at the door every 10 seconds. He'll show or he won't." Emma forced a breath through her nose. "I'm fine." "You're lying." She smiled faintly. "Probably." At that moment, Lucas's gaze flicked toward the entrance. Emma followed his line of sight and saw James stepping into the room, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a simple blazer. No tailored suit, no entourage, just him. He looked around uncertainly until his eyes landed on Lucas. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Lucas lifted his hand in a small wave. James walked over, slowly, as if expecting someone to stop him at any moment. Emma stayed where she was, letting Lucas control this moment. He had asked for it, after all. She watched as James crouched slightly to be at Lucas's eye level. "Hi," James said, his voice rougher than Emma remembered. I know who you are." Lucas interrupted, not unkindly. "Do you know how a heart works?" James blinked. I know some things." Lucas nodded, businesslike. "Good, I'll show you the rest." Emma watched them quietly. Lucas explaining his model in detail. His hands precise as he pointed out how the valves closed properly, how the atria filled with blood before contracting. James listened intently, asking a few thoughtful questions. No awkwardness, no tension, just curiosity on both sides. Sarah touched Emma's arm. "You're not breathing." "I'm fine," Emma whispered. Sarah arched a brow but said nothing. When the presentation ended, Lucas handed James a tablet with his design files. "You can look at these later." James took it, his hands shaking just slightly. "Thank you." Lucas nodded again, already moving back to adjust his display before the judges arrived. James straightened slowly and turned to Emma. "You raised an extraordinary kid." Emma's mouth was dry. "He raised himself." James didn't argue. "Thank you for letting me be here." She considered him for a long moment. "This doesn't change anything." "I know." But as he walked away, Emma noticed something different in his step. Not lighter, not easier, just resigned. Lucas won the science fair, of course. His name was announced with excitement. His model Harmony praised for its potential impact on pediatric surgery. Emma stood beside him as the medal was placed around his neck. His grin was blinding. On the ride home, Lucas was quiet, staring out the window. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked softly. Lucas shrugged. He listened. Emma reached over and brushed his hair back gently. "Wes," he did. Lucas didn't speak again until they were home and Emma was tucking him into bed. "Will he come back?" Emma hesitated. "I don't know." Lucas nodded as if he'd expected that. "Okay." And just like that, he closed his eyes and drifted to sleep. Emma stayed beside him for a long time, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. The next morning, there was a letter on her desk. No return address, but she knew the handwriting immediately. She opened it carefully. "I don't deserve to be his father, but if he ever needs me, I'll be here." It was unsigned. But Emma folded it neatly and put it in the same box that held the letters she'd saved for Lucas when he was older. One day, maybe, he'd want to read them. Maybe he wouldn't. Either way, Emma was done making decisions for anyone but herself and her son. Over the next year, Lucas grew even more brilliant. His designs were featured in medical journals, his name mentioned in conferences. Emma found herself balancing two lives: the surgeon pioneering techniques that saved children across the world, and the mother of a boy whose mind worked faster than anyone could keep up with. By the time Lucas was 8, he had already filed his first patent. They celebrated with pizza on the living room floor, laughing over how Lucas had insisted on writing every detail of the paperwork himself. Sarah joined them, raising a glass of apple juice in a toast. "To the youngest genius I've ever met," she said. Lucas grinned. "You're just saying that because I fixed your tablet." Emma laughed, but later, when Lucas was in bed, Sarah caught her by the kitchen sink. "James sent another letter," Sarah said softly. Emma wiped her hands dry. "I know, Lucas told me." "He did." Emma paused. "He's not angry." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "And you?" Emma thought about it. About James's choices, his absence, his slow crawl back towards something resembling responsibility. "I don't have room for anger anymore." "Cool." Sarah nodded. "Good." One day, they received an invitation to an international medical conference. Lucas had been asked to present a joint paper with Emma on their new heart valve model. It was in Singapore. Emma stared at the envelope for a long time. Lucas appeared at her side, his expression curious. "Will he be there?" "Maybe," Emma said. Lucas thought about that. Okay, they went. And if James was in the audience during Lucas' presentation, neither Emma nor Lucas mentioned it. They delivered their talk. They answered questions. They received a standing ovation. Later, when they visited the aquarium Lucas had loved as a toddler, they saw James sitting alone on a bench near the jellyfish exhibit. He didn't approach. He didn't wave. He simply watched them for a moment, then left. Lucas said nothing. Neither did Emma Knight. Lucas climbed into her bed and curled up beside her. "You did everything," he whispered. Emma kissed his forehead. "You're everything." And in that quiet, she finally believed it. The spring rain fell softly against the windows of the Henderson Pediatric Wing, a steady rhythm that somehow made the day feel slower, heavier. Emma stood in her office, watching the droplets trace patterns down the glass. Lucas's voice echoed faintly from down the hall, explaining the basics of cardiac anatomy to a group of visiting high school students. Though Emma knew half the terms Lucas used were beyond even their textbooks. At 10 years old, he was already being called a prodigy. Medical journals now requested interviews with him directly, not just Emma. There were days it made her heart swell with pride. Today, it made her chest ache with something harder to name. Sarah stepped in quietly, holding 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Emma without a word, following her gaze out the window. "You're thinking too much." "I'm always thinking too much." Sarah smirked. "Lucas is fine." Emma nodded slowly. "I know, but fine was relative." Lucas's mind was razor sharp, his skill in design and diagnostics unmatched for his age. But Emma couldn't stop wondering if he missed something. The kind of childhood other kids had. Birthday parties with messy cakes and soccer games. Sleepovers and cartoons without them turning into anatomy lessons. His world was hospitals, research labs, and conference rooms. It was a world she'd built for him. But sometimes late at night, she wondered if it was enough. "He's not just fine," Sarah said quietly, interrupting Emma's thoughts again. "He's happy." Emma managed a thin smile. "I hope so." "You know so." Sarah took a long sip of her tea. "And before you start worrying about the next conference or research paper, maybe we should take a vacation." "A vacation," Emma repeated, like it was a foreign word. Sarah raised a brow. "Yeah, you know. Beaches, sunscreen, lazy days. I have surgery scheduled for the next 3 weeks. Lucas doesn't." Sarah's tone softened. "And neither do I." "Think about it." Emma did think about it. That night, she found Lucas curled up on the couch, sketching something on his tablet. It looked like a robotic exoskeleton, with notes scribbled around it about mobility assistance. "You want to build that?" Emma asked gently. Lucas nodded. "For kids who can't walk." She brushed his hair back from his forehead. "You're incredible, you know that." He shrugged, like it was nothing. "You taught me." Emma sat beside him for a moment. "What if we took a break? No hospitals, no designing. Just us. A beach somewhere." Lucas blinked at her. "No science." "Maybe a little science," Emma conceded with a grin. "But mostly just swimming, sandcastles, normal stuff." Lucas was quiet, thoughtful. Then he said, "Okay, can we go snorkeling? I want to study the fish up close." Emma laughed. "Of course." They booked a trip to Hawaii. For 2 weeks, Emma forced herself to leave the hospital behind. They built sandcastles that ended up as anatomically correct hearts. They snorkeled and watched sea turtles glide through the reefs. They ate shaved ice until their teeth ached. Lucas laughed freely, his curiosity endless but untethered from work for once. And for the first time in years, Emma let herself relax. On their last night, they stood on the beach watching the sunset, the sky painted in colors Emma would never be able to describe. Lucas slipped his hand into hers. "I like this." "Mem too," Emma said softly. "I think he'd like it too," Lucas said after a long pause. Emma knew who he meant. She squeezed his hand gently but said nothing. Back home, life resumed. Lucas returned to his research with renewed energy. Emma scheduled surgeries. Sarah started planning a new wing at the hospital. The days blurred in their familiar rhythm, but something had shifted. Lucas was more open about his feelings, occasionally asking questions about his father. Emma answered honestly, without bitterness. One evening, after presenting their latest research at Johns Hopkins, Emma found an envelope waiting on her hotel room desk. There was no name, but the handwriting was familiar. Inside was a simple note. "Thank you for raising him so well." No signature, no return address. Just that one sentence. Emma stared at it for a long time before folding it neatly and tucking into her journal. She didn't mention it to Lucas. A year later, the Henderson Pediatric Wing expanded again. Lucas's designs were now standard equipment in over 200 hospitals. Emma's pioneering work earned her another prestigious award, though she declined the formal gala to spend the evening with Lucas building a model rocket in their backyard. They stood together watching it launch into the sky, Lucas's laughter rising as the rocket soared higher than either of them expected. "He would have liked this too," Lucas said after a while, quiet. Emma rested her hand on his shoulder. "He would have." Lucas didn't ask for more. The following month, James sent a formal request for visitation. This time, Emma didn't immediately reject it. She read the letter carefully. It wasn't a plea. It was an acknowledgement of mistakes, of consequences. She brought it to Lucas. He read it twice. "I want to meet him." Emma's chest tightened. "You're sure?" Lucas nodded. "I need to know." They arranged a meeting at a quiet park. James arrived alone. No suit. No pretense. Just a man trying to find a place in his son's life. Lucas approached first, his stride confident but weary. They spoke softly, sitting on a bench by the pond. Emma watched from a distance, her heart pounding. They talked for over an hour. Lucas asked hard questions. James answered them. He didn't deflect. He didn't sugarcoat. Emma respected him for that. When they finished, Lucas returned to her side. His face was unreadable for a long moment. "Well?" Emma asked gently. Lucas shrugged. "He's trying." Emma exhaled, slowly. "And you?" Lucas took her hand. "I still want you to be the one who picks me up from the hospital." Emma laughed, blinking back tears. "I can do that." They walked home together, the evening quiet between them. Lucas didn't mention James again for weeks. When he did, it was casual, like asking about the weather. "He wants to help with my next project," Lucas said one afternoon. "That's okay." Emma smiled softly. "It's okay." James didn't become a constant presence, but he became something. A steady voice on the phone, an extra set of eyes on Lucas's designs. Lucas set the boundaries, and James respected them. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt something that resembled peace. Lucas turned 12 the year he performed his first supervised heart surgery. Emma stood in the observation room, watching her son work with precision and care. Sarah stood beside her, arms crossed, smiling. "You did it," Sarah whispered. Emma shook her head. "He did." And as Lucas finished the procedure, lifting his eyes briefly to meet hers through the glass, Emma knew one thing for certain. They were exactly where they were meant to be. Lucas stood at the head of the table, his hand steady, his voice clear as he explained the complexities of his latest pediatric heart valve design to a room filled with some of the most respected surgeons in the world. He had just turned 14, but his confidence and knowledge erased any doubt that he belonged there. Emma watched him from the back of the conference room, pride warming her chest as he answered every question with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. When the session ended, Lucas gathered his notes, exchanging polite conversation with colleagues twice, even 3 times his age. As he walked toward her, Emma caught the glimmer in his eye, the one he always got when he was already planning his next big idea. You're thinking about the valve redesign already, aren't you? Emma said as he reached her. Lucas gave her a crooked smile. I think I can cut the failure rate by another 2%. Emma chuckled and rested a hand on his shoulder. Let's get lunch first, then you can save the world. Outside the conference center, the city buzzed under a pale blue sky. They found a quiet cafe and settled into a corner table. Lucas picked apart a sandwich, his mind clearly still elsewhere. Emma let him sit with his thoughts for a while, watching the light play across his features, the echoes of James there in his sharp jawline, the curve of his mouth. But his eyes were all her. Focused, determined, endlessly curious. Dad called this morning, Lucas said after a pause, not looking up. Emma nodded slowly. Did he? He wants me to visit Singapore this summer. He's working with a children's hospital there. Lucas finally met her gaze. I think I want to go. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty. He was telling her, not asking, and that was as it should be. She took a slow breath, choosing her words carefully. Do you trust him to show up the way you need him to? She asked softly. Lucas thought about it for a long moment. I think he's trying. Emma smiled faintly. Then I trust you. They finished their meal and wandered through the city for a while, talking about everything and nothing. Later, they flew home. Henderson's cardiac wing was waiting. Patients were waiting. Their work was waiting. Weeks passed. Lucas's upcoming trip to Singapore became another item on the calendar. He was calm about it, matter of fact. Emma was the one who lay awake some nights, wondering how far things would go. But when she saw Lucas testing his new valve prototype, focused and meticulous, her worries softened. The night before his flight, they sat on the back porch under a sky dusted with stars. You're not worried, are you? Lucas asked as he adjusted the telescope's lens. I'm always a little worried, Emma admitted, but I'm also proud and excited for you. He turned, his expression serious. I'll be back in a month. Ah, Emma smiled. I know. At the airport, they hugged tightly. Lucas stood taller than her now. When had that happened? He boarded his plane with the easy confidence of someone who knew who he was and where he was going. Emma watched until he disappeared into the crowd, then stood there a moment longer. At home, the house was too quiet without him. Sarah stopped by more often, filling the space with easy conversation. Emma threw herself into her research, her surgeries, and the constant work that had always given her life purpose. But she missed him. She missed the sound of his footsteps pacing the hall when he was deep in thought. She missed his late, night questions about anatomy and astrophysics. 2 weeks later, Lucas sent her a picture from Singapore, him and James standing outside a children's hospital, both wearing scrubs. James looked different, softer somehow. Lucas was smiling, and it wasn't forced. Emma stared at the photo for a long time before saving it to her phone. James sent an email a few days after that. Short, respectful, an update on Lucas's progress with the hospital's research team. He ended it with a simple thank you. Emma read it twice before responding. Thank you for showing up for him, she wrote back. When Lucas returned, he was full of stories about the children he worked with, the surgeries he'd observed, the new techniques he was excited to try back home. He spoke about James in a quiet, thoughtful way. Not hero worship, not bitterness, just acceptance of who he was and who he wasn't. One evening, Lucas found Emma on the back porch, watching the sun set over the city. He wants to come visit, Lucas said, sitting beside her. I told him it's up to you. Emma took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. If you want him here, I'm okay with that. Lucas nodded, thoughtful. I want him to see what we've built. They scheduled the visit for a quiet weekend. James arrived with little fanfare, carrying nothing but an overnight bag. He greeted Emma politely, his eyes lingering on the house that had become Lucas's world. James toured the hospital with them, listened as Lucas explained his projects, met some of the children Lucas had designed devices for. There was no arrogance in him now, no cold detachment, just a quiet reverence for the life his son had created. That night after Lucas had gone to bed, James lingered in the kitchen. Emma made tea, her hand steady as she poured his cup. You've raised an extraordinary person, James said quietly. Emma gave a small smile. I know. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice rough, about everything. Emma studied him for a long moment. Wes, you were. James set down his cup. Thank you for not shutting me out completely." She shook her head. "This isn't about you. It never was. It's about what's best for Lucas." He nodded, accepting that. "I'm grateful to be part of it, even a small part." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The past had shaped them, but it didn't own them. As the years passed, James remained in Lucas's life as much as Lucas wanted him to be. Emma focused on her work, on Lucas's work, on the life they had built together. They traveled to conferences, spoke at universities, designed innovations that changed the future of pediatric medicine. And through it all, Lucas never forgot where he came from. He carried both his parents' legacies, the mistakes and the triumphs. And he carved his own path, one patient at a time. On the eve of Lucas's 18th birthday, Emma found him in his workshop, tweaking one of his earliest designs. "You still thinking about fixing that old valve?" she asked, amused. Lucas grinned. "It's where I started. I like remembering." Emma rested a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way." "So have you," he said quietly. They stood there for a moment, mother and son, partners and pioneers. Everything they'd built stood solid beneath them. "Happy birthday, Lucas," Emma whispered. He hugged her, and for once she let herself rest.